Paul St-Pierre Plamondon qui a fait une tournée. Justement, il est allé donner une conférence en Alberta pour parler de l'indépendance du Québec. Donc, on va voir ce que ça donne.
I have to say, I'm very glad to be here. I know my predecessors, René Lévesque in the 70s, Western Canada, Jacques Parizeau was here in 1991. Before I start, I genuinely thought that the conversation we read often in the media and in the political space of Quebec and Alberta debating their own choices, whether that choice is right or wrong and whether they would have done the same choice, is just the wrong framework. I always thought that if you take a step back and you think about democracy and respect of our respective parliaments, there's a lot to be said and there's a lot of space for collaboration. So it's in that mentality that I come here this morning. Leaders of the Parti québécois who have done that. I've done a few conferences in England, Scotland, France, and Belgium, basically to explain why we're doing this again, why it's still there, that idea of Quebec's independence, and to answer questions. I love universities for that. So I really thank the School of Public Policy of the University of Calgary for. I want to just a quick word on Charlie Kirk. I want to say that what we're doing this morning is very important, whether you agree with me or not. So I just want to, because as you know, being an independentist is not always easy in the sense that criticism can get quite intense. There's been threats in my case, threats for many people who take part of in the public debate. And I just want to say that what we're doing this morning, no matter whether or not you agree with me, is very important.
Moi, quand j'écoutais ça, j'étais content parce que ouais, moi, c'est sûr, je connais bien Paul, là, mais il a réussi à bien recentrer le débat sur quelque chose qui, pour moi, c'est ça qui m'a amené à l'indépendance personnellement. C'est la démocratie. C'est-à-dire qu'il existe un État fédéral qui ne respecte pas la volonté des États provinciaux. Mais ces États-là sont les volontés de ces États-là sont l'émanation de la volonté des gens qui vivent sur ces territoires-là. L'État fédéral n'est pas en position supérieure en théorie. Là, c'était pas le... Déjà, on ne l'a pas accepté, mais c'était même pas ça le deal là, à la base. Mais ce qui est intéressant, c'est vraiment de replacer ça dans le cadre de l'État fédéral refuse des décisions des États provinciaux, alors que ces États provinciaux-là sont tout à fait légitimes dans leurs compétences et dans leurs volontés qui sont exprimées. C'est ça le problème fondamental du Canada. On est soumis à ça. On vit ça plus souvent que les autres parce qu'on a un ensemble de valeurs puis de pratiques politiques qui sont encore plus en contradiction avec l'État fédéral, mais les autres provinces aussi vivent ça. Et là, c'est pour ça qu'il est allé en Alberta pour dire aux Albertains, on partage au moins ça. Puis à la place de se chicaner entre nous sur pourquoi votre province fait ces choix-là, puis l'autre... Non, le problème, c'est que l'État central, fédéral, ne respecte pas nos choix différents. Mais ça, c'est la première étape du raisonnement parce qu'il va aller plus loin, puis c'est là que c'est tout aussi intéressant.
This conference is about democracy. I mean, you want the answer to what does Quebec want? Self-determination through democracy. It's plain and simple, so there's no substitute for it. It was true for patriots in Quebec in 1988, saying, we cannot be in a colonial regime where our voice doesn't count, where we're not in a genuine democracy. That idea has been there forever, and it's still the same idea. So the fundamental idea behind the resurgence of Quebec's independence is that we don't think that it's viable to have a parliament in which we have around 20% of the seats. We don't think it's viable in terms of getting the right policies for our specific context. What is this specific context in North America? It comes with a different culture, you might say. It comes with different choices. That's not the point. And we have a parliament called the National Assembly, making choices that are contradicted by that parliament or that regime so often, it is still a problem of democracy. You probably so a mayor in Toronto who wrote a book, The Question of Quebec Separatism. Everything is in there. In understanding those dynamics, she foresaw everything.
40.
Mainly that if you have a government unit that is so big with different realities, different regions, and that that unit will have to decide between competing or incompatible interests, well, it's not ideal at all. And she thought that if Montreal is to stay with some economic relevance, and if Quebec is to stay with some future for the French language, she thought that Quebec needed to be a country because otherwise, this 20% in the House of Congress do it. And that's...
Puis honnêtement, là, c'est tellement vrai parce que, imaginez, là, il y a 80 ans, on était, à l'époque, c'était des Canadiens français, mais les Canadiens français étaient 35% au Canada, la population. Imaginez comment le poids politique était disproportionnellement plus grand qu'aujourd'hui. Comment il y avait encore plus de pouvoir au Québec. Il y avait plus, parce que la majorité était quand même située au Québec. Il y avait beaucoup plus de pouvoir au Québec. La population était plus importante. Ça fait juste descendre. Puis le monde, ils viennent puis ils nous disent « Ah non, la prochaine fois, on va y arriver. » C'est si on réessaye de réformer, là, si on se met tout dans l'autobus puis on s'en va à Ottawa demander quelque chose, là, cette fois-ci, ils vont nous le donner. Alors que, objectivement, notre poids politique fait juste descendre.
Moi, ce que j'aime, c'est qu'il rappelle vraiment les fondamentaux du projet indépendantiste.
Ouais.
Il ne change pas son message, qu'il soit en Alberta ou ici. Il rappelle vraiment les causes, les raisons fondamentales et intrinsèques de pourquoi le Québec devrait devenir un pays face à une audience albertaine. Moi, déjà, ça, j'aime ça.
Ce n'est que le début.
That's the second argument to the fundamental. So the first one is that feeling that voting bloc québécois that represents many of the aspirations of Quebecers will never lead to a Canadian government. It's just pure democracy and self-determination. And the question becomes, you know, how you felt after 10 years of Justin Trudeau, but I had many criticisms. And it's a bit surprising that we're still in the same regime. So I think to a certain extent, you might have the same question. What do you do if you don't feel that your voice or your and there's no rotation of power? That's the case for Quebec all the time, because the Bloc Québécois will never be in power in Ottawa. Second argument that you probably know is linguistic and cultural sustainability. Honestly, I just don't think there's any future for the Francophone Quebec culture if we stay in Canada. And it's not a blame, it's just a reality. You cannot have policies in Ottawa not taking into account how fragile 2% and this smaller in language is. You cannot have the current system and still be speaking French and having a Quebec culture in 100 years from now, especially if you have immigration, an ideological drift as far to that. But the shrinking of the French language in Quebec is a reality, it's documented, and it's directly linked to many federal policies that do not represent the will of the people on Quebec's territory. So that's a classic argument, but it's a more acute argument as of today because it's moving fast. With that comes the argument of political weight. So I said 20% of more or less of the seats or the parliament, but it comes with a weakening of Quebec in an ever growing Canada in terms of population, in which case are we capable of following the pace with an integration in French? So far, it's not the case. So we look at the situation, we cannot influence that parliament, and we cannot cope with those policies. And it's not as if it's an accident. I mean, the Century Initiative is not an accident, and it's not of Premier François Legault, but he said on several occasions, you need to listen to us in terms of adapting your policies to our reality, and have said, Justin Trudeau at the time, you're going to create the biggest housing crisis we've ever seen if you continue, and they continued willingly intentionally. So it has to be said if you want to understand, and I see heads nodding, I mean, it's not only in Quebec.
C'est fondamental.
And it is undemocratic as far as I'm concerned, because the democratic will is very clear, set aside for ideological. And one ideological difference between Quebec and the current, it's a very important conversation about communitarism versus universal. So in Quebec's mentality, everyone can become Quebecer. And they must become Quebecer if we have some chance of sustainability from a linguistic and cultural standpoint. But we never thought that Pierre Trudeau's idea of communities living aside one another, clientelism based on ethnocultural identities, we never social peace. Are we wrong? Are we right? I'm here to debate, but that's the case of what.
J'aime comment à chaque fois, tu vois, je trouve que c'est une belle approche parce qu'à chaque fois, il vient et il dit, regardez, c'est ça le consensus qu'on a chez nous. Tu sais, vous n'êtes pas d'accord, mais c'est pas ça qui est important. Ce qui est important, c'est on a le droit d'avoir nos propres consensus. Puis ils peuvent être différents de vous. Puis le problème qu'on a, c'est que chaque fois qu'on a un consensus au Québec sur un sujet, ou pas un consensus, mais tu sais, disons, un consensus, je pense que c'est même le mot. On peut pas le concrétiser, il peut pas exister à Ottawa. Il peut pas se réaliser. Parce que Ottawa est pris dans une dynamique avec des intérêts tellement éclatés qu'il peut pas bien nous servir, nous. Il faut toujours qu'il calcule. Nous, on est perdants là-dedans. On est perdants là-dedans. Puis notre intérêt, c'est qu'on puisse chacun être souverain, puis après, on aura les résultats qu'on a, tu sais. Puis on sera responsable des résultats qu'on aura.
On pourra négocier d'égal à égal, on pourra coopérer d'égal à égal, mais le Québec, comme province canadienne, sous tutelle canadienne du gouvernement fédéral, c'est pas ça l'avenir pour nous. Ça ne fonctionne pas.
We think that universality, identity based on being a citizen of a society, being equal because we all pay taxes, tax income to a government, and we're all bound by the same laws, that's a source of identity that creates social peace. But religious, ethnocultural, and community-based identity for us is unsustainable at many levels, one of which is social peace in terms of just Quebec has a reputation of being easygoing. You go to Montreal, it's safe, people are, you say joie de vivre. Yeah, there is that in Quebec. And we think it has value. I might surprise you with the next argument. I really think, based on that document, the finance of different economists from 6 different universities, I really think it's... So you might be sending you money and you're telling us that being part of that system is not beneficial to you. And I will have to answer yes, because the amount of waste and duplication in Ottawa is out of hand. The main problem in the work of...
Puis encore là, moi je persiste et signe sur ça. Là. La raison pourquoi le gouvernement fédéral barre en coup, c'est parce que la distance entre le pouvoir et la population est en train de s'éloigner de plus en plus à mesure que le pays voit une multiplication d'intérêts divergents. Ça devient de plus en plus une question de ramasser des votes de certaines communautés, de faire des alliances d'électorat. Il n'y a pas d'intérêt national qui propulse le Canada. Le Mark Carney est arrivé en disant... C'était ça son discours finalement. Il nous a dit oui, ça existe l'intérêt national canadien, c'est de ne pas devenir américain. Ça a des grandes limites. Là. Un, Donald Trump, il n'est pas éternel. Là. Puis deux, il a cédé sur tout. Fait. Mais au fondamental, c'est ça, c'est qu'il y a des intérêts qui sont divergents. Le pouvoir est éloigné de nous. Puis nous, on a de moins en moins de prise sur ce pouvoir-là. Ce qui fait que les gens là, qui mettent en place la fonction publique sont complètement détachés de toute responsabilité envers la population. Ils ne nous doivent plus rien. Il y a une multiplication des ministères, une multiplication des programmes, parce que ces gouvernements-là ne se font pas élire là-dessus. Donc, ils se déresponsabilisent. C'est extrêmement malsain pour notre démocratie de vivre dans ce régime-là.
What Ottawa does is that we always take for granted that what Ottawa does is useful. and that we would need to do the same if we would be independent, and Quebec or anyone. It's not true. It's just duplication. We're sending $90 billion every year to Ottawa. What do we get? Dysfunctional passports, an army, put it in, and what else? And if I become Premier of Quebec next year, I need to make healthcare, education, and social services work. And you might disagree on how generous the Quebec system is. Bottom line is that is the democratic will of my people, and I intend to step up. But if I only have half of my tax income, the other half going to Ottawa for I don't know what, except for abuse of power and duplication, I have a in terms of governing. And that's what happened to François Legault, and that's what happened to Philippe Couillard, and that's what happened to everyone else before. It's very hard to be at workable level of government if you only have more or less half of your revenues. And I don't think we're having value. I have a list of how many drifts and ways we take that. It is an issue for me. I talked about immigration and borders. I just want to say that Quebec has been very clear when Justin Trudeau opened Roxham and people were coming in without any planification. Quebec has been very clear. What are you doing? We are not agreeing with that. And they just kept on. And again, borders will become whether we like it or not. And we can have a debate on how we have sustainable models, how we respect human rights while respecting that you do not invent overnight housing. You cannot create them overnight. An important factor. I would add a general factor of justice. Whether we agree or not, I just want to say that if you've been trying to get recognition internationally for centuries, recognition within Canada that you're a people, we got it in terms of your determination and democracy, direct democracy people. And it is a matter of justice because Francophones, as you know, there's history behind this. It's just not something that we started talking about 10 years ago in Quebec. So for me, it is also a matter of justice for René Lévesque, for Jacques Parizeau, for people who lost the second referendum in all sorts of cheating. By the way, it's important, maybe we will be able to talk about it, but it is important for me to say that so you get the context in Quebec and the context of a country that cannot be reformed. So we've tried Meach, we've tried all sorts of accommodation. I know people are tired sometimes of how much accommodation there was, adjustments there were for Quebec. We can talk about that, but I think it's fair to say that that constitution and that regime is impossible to reform. And I think we could agree on that, which opens up a whole different conversation. What do we have in common and what can we work on together? Because
basé tous les principes, là.
One thing that worked well
on a été
with
colonisé,
the Legault's government, and we can have some parallel with Daniel Smith, is that the Legault government went with 21 fundamental demands to Ottawa saying, this is legitimate and we are such a strong government. We have 90 seats out of 125. We're so strong, you're going to listen to our demands and we're going to get some strong wins. That's what François Legault said on several occasions. Des gros gains, strong wins in Canada. Ended up with 0. So what's going to happen with Alberta, who has very legitimate demands, and it's not the same positions, it's not the same stance on what we should be doing on a subject, but it is self-determination and democracy. And in that sense, for me, it's very legitimate, whether Quebec would do the same or not. So we can open, I think, a conversation on the abuse of power there is from a constitution in 1867 on which we never voted, so Quebec was never consulted, and a constitution that never intended the federal government to grab as much money in our pocket to after intervene in all the powers of the provinces. I mean, what is it if it's not an abuse of power? Where is it written that you can just deciding in the stead of a democratic...
Moi, je me souviens, ça m'avait... Je vous dis, ça me faisait dresser les cheveux sur la tête quand j'étais à Ottawa. Et j'arrêtais pas de demander à ma députée de poser des questions là-dessus. J'étais comme, ça se peut pas, genre, il faut qu'ils reconnaissent qu'ils font n'importe quoi. Les libéraux, là, ils sont hostiles, qui sont attachés à leur charte des droits, là. Puis, tu sais, ils veulent même enlever le droit de... En tout cas, il y en a plusieurs qui voulaient même enlever le droit à la clause dérogatoire dans la Constitution canadienne, puis la charte des droits et libertés. Hey, ça, là, c'est important, c'est notre Constitution, c'est notre charte. Mais quand tu leur rappelles que dans la Constitution, ils ne sont pas supposés intervenir en éducation, en santé... Là, la Constitution, on dirait que tout d'un coup, là, c'est comme plus flou, puis c'est non, on a le droit. Ça n'a pas été écrit de même, ça n'a pas été pensé de même, mais la Cour nous a dit qu'on avait le droit. Ils sont vraiment le double jeu sur cet enjeu-là. Ça me faisait capoter à quel point ils s'en foutent de la Constitution du Canada. Les libéraux canadiens, là, ils s'en torchent la Constitution du Canada. Ils s'en torchent bien raide. C'est malade.
Democratically elected parliament using money, saying, if you're a university and you want federal money, which is your money, well, you'll have to follow the area, you'll have to follow this, you'll have to do this. It's abusing the Constitution. So that's a fundamental point. And I have to say that arguing on how much money Quebec gets, we can debate on calculation. So you have péréquation, but you also have direct investment and so on. It's irrelevant now because if I'm premier next year, I agree that Quebec shouldn't have money from Alberta, and I respect your choices. I just want respect of our own choices. And all we have is a illegitimate government creating interference and trying to decide in our place and grabbing a lot of money for services I don't see. So, I mean, the size of the public service in Ottawa has almost doubled, and the quality of services have been really going the wrong way. And then you have Phoenix, Arrivcan, the sponsorship scandal, subsidies of Green Fund. I mean, why are we accepting that? I think it's worth to ask the question here. And on the concept of abuse of power, it's not only the spending power that is abusive, it's the way the Ottawa has intervened in Quebec. So I just want to put in context what I've experienced yet. But the sponsorship scandal, cheating at the referendum, are things like arresting members of the PQ and independentists, poets in 1970, stealing the list of the members of the Parti québécois. That's what the RCMP has done. Illegal spying on politicians. All leaders of the Parti québécois have been spied on.
Yo, moi je prends un risque, là, mais je suis sûr qu'il est en train de leur dire tout ça pour leur dire, là, à votre référendum, faites attention, là. Ils vont jouer sale, là. Faites-vous pas avoir, nous autres, ça nous a pris 2 fois avant de comprendre, là, mais...
So I assume right now that I'm being taped. All this is not normal. All this is not normal, and it is also abuse of power. When, go and we're going to cover the rest, but a few points that I would like to discuss. We could have a conversation space, a discussion and thinking space directly between Quebec and Alberta, accepting that we might not have the same political orientations, but basically building a relationship based on respect. And respect is about respect of democracy and of our respective parliaments. And if we have that, we might find that there are several points where we can work together, and those where we don't agree, it's much better that we respect that we don't agree and we do our own thing than to have that federal government trying to impose things that will never be satisfying for everyone because they are sometimes incompatible or conflicting interests. So someone will win, someone will not win. And you saw that with respect to the United States. You saw provinces negotiating directly because they know that the common position of Canada will be incompatible, irreconcilable, because it's not the same interest, it's not the same position. So there's some space, I think, and that's why I'm here. It doesn't matter what it creates, but there is a space for conversation about another framework, because I'm sure that we're, to a certain extent, bound to collaborate in the future, no matter how. But is the current framework working for you? Is it working for me? Could we imagine another framework that would be closer to what the word confederation, I don't know. But I think it's important that we think about it, because I really believe that the current framework is not reformable, and it will create more abuse of power. It doesn't mean if you have an autonomous government right now, doesn't mean you won't win anything. The abuse of powers might stop a bit, you might gain something, but as soon as you'll have a government that is not autonomous, it's the nature of power struggles, or the thirst for power. And I don't think that power in Ottawa is legitimate in terms of democracy, nor legitimate in terms of our constitution, which is a bit ironic. So that's the starting point for that conversation. I think it's exciting and necessary. So I'm very glad to be here this morning.
Je n'étais pas sûr, mais dans le livre de Vincent Geloso, il y a quand même une solide démonstration de comment ça fonctionne. Après, peut-être qu'il y a des critiques à faire, là, mais il arrive quand même à montrer très bien l'effet pervers que ça a de faire les péréquations. Puis moi, j'ai écouté aussi, j'ai écouté beaucoup de vidéos de Daniel Smith là, qui explique c'est malade. Pour vrai, je pense que c'est une des meilleures vidéos que j'ai jamais vues sur le déséquilibre fiscal. C'est sûr, je m'en inspire, mais eux, ils ont du budget. Mais ils ont fait une vidéo, puis elle explique ça, comment les incitatifs, justement, du gouvernement fédéral sont vraiment mauvais pour le développement de chacune des provinces. Là. Pour tout le monde, c'est mauvais. Ce système-là est mauvais pour tout le monde. C'est ça qui passe comme message. Puis je pense que c'est bien réussi. Il y a cette... Ouais, je pense pas qu'on va pas écouter l'heure au complet là, du reste de l'entrevue. Et moi, c'était l'autre entrevue, le podcast. J'arrive plus à retrouver le lien. Je vais aller fouiller. On va laisser rouler, puis je vais trouver ça.
Same thing for natural resources. That's another subject, but it's a bit of the same pattern. We need to be careful with money just coming out of the sky, because it kills entrepreneurship. You have to remember also that when Alberta oil really spiked, it had an impact, a very clear impact on exports in Quebec. So having one monetary unit that reflects petroleum in Alberta has an impact on what we can do in Quebec. And we're told, yeah, you lost something there, but we're giving you money. And oftentimes, as far as I'm concerned, it comes with too much contempt. So I don't want that for Quebec's future. And I don't think it's healthy from an economic standpoint. And the thing is, we've calculated how does it look? It's been done 7 times. And if you take all the duplication and all the money spent on no services, and you spend it on healthcare and education in Quebec, I think at the very end, even though we don't get equalization payments, we'll be better off. And it's more healthy in terms of taking initiative, in terms of building a future that is ours. It's way more healthy equalization system.
C'est ça que j'ai repris pour la vidéo sur la péréquation. J'ai repris les données là-dedans. Longue entrevue quand même qu'il a faite.
Publisher of the Western Standard. Today is September 11th, 2025. Today I'm joined by better known as PSPP. He is the leader of the party. He took over the leadership of that party when it was down to just 3 seats and ever. But has just this morning, he was speaking at the University of Calgary, speaking about the challenges of Quebec and the West. It's a fantastic on the kinds of issues we face in the West from the similar-ish they have in Quebec. Paul, thank you very much for joining.
My pleasure.
So, outside of Quebec, standing of the Parti Québécois, and in most provinces, a spectrum, NDP, in Quebec, nationalist axis go along that. The national spectrum lines up very because our nationalist movement is not so much based on culture, language. So I don't know. Maybe if you could just start with, how should an English Canadian understand the Parti Québécois?
Let's give it a shot. I think you're correct. So the Parti Québécois is a party founded upon a willingness of the population in Quebec for self-determination. So what it is about is democracy and making our own choices, not sending money to Ottawa for them, with only 20% of the seats, for them to decide what we ought to do with that money. It's particular, of course, in the case of Quebec. You're correct to say that the linguistic and cultural aspect of it is important, because if you can't make your own policies and spend your own money, you will see very important challenges in terms of sustaining, having durability for the French language, the Quebec culture, but it goes also to immigration, the place of the judiciary power that is always part of Canada, in favor of what would have been the democratic choice of Quebec. So you have the democratic will of Quebecers is overruled by a federal government that tends to abuse its powers by spending in fields that should be the fields of the provinces. In terms of right and left, Quebec in general tend to be, so you'll see if you go in the United States, elsewhere, there is radical left and there is the behavior in general is more towards the center. Parti Québécois has had periods where it was quite to the left, to the right of the center, but it's always close to the center. You can say that. And as for the current Parti Québécois, it will be now 5 years this fall that I'm the leader of the Parti Québécois. And I think you could say we're left social democrats, which is, yeah, you could say moderate left. And sometimes we're right. So it's very difficult to read from a more standard left-right spectrum because of many factors. But what I think would be comparable is a few Scandinavians who came to the conclusion that radical left ideas had a catastrophic impact on their social peace and on their services and so on. And the idea that it should be a market-based free market society where the richer will contribute to a safety net, to services that are available to everyone. So that's what I would call social democracy, not the same than socialist, because socialist is not believing in free market. And yet a very strong criticism from my part of the direction Canada took under Trudeau, not only the ideology, the counterproductive ideology during that, still the same people and the same ideas, I think.
So nationalism is, broadly speaking, with the right, nationalism is more on, say, the Scot. It's a left, in the independent associated with the left. Then in Quebec, associated a bit. Alberta, 66% support independents. It's
which from Quebec's perspective is incomprehensible. Because if your pretension is that you should have funding for services to the population and that safety net could be better, why would you send a substantial part of your income tax to a government that just is wasting your money, giving you very few services in return? Why would you do that? Yeah,
I think from there, think of the way we would think of Anglophones in Quebec, that if the left would be permanently shut out of power government. I think that
I don't think it's a valid argument.
To speak on their behalf, which is obviously subpar. So you've said you're committed. If the Parti Québécois, you're holding a third. I think you. But it's not, as Lucien Bouchard said, not. We're gonna do it.
Yeah.
But what is sometimes ambiguous? The first round, independence and sovereignty from Quebec. When we say independence in Alberta, we mean erupted, a separate independent country, completely on its own, severed, direct state ties from Canada.
Yep. It's exactly the same right now for the Parti Québécois.
Yeah, within Canada, but when you say sovereign, talking about Republic of Quebec and it is its own country.
I say independence. That's it. It continues in the sovereignty association model, or at least discourse. That discourse will be met with, it's giving Ottawa power to respond by saying, oh, you think we'll collaborate, you think it will go well. It's going to, the fear takes all the place because you're dependent on the interpretation of a regime that feels threatened or that feels there might be losing powers, so they will not help you. So I think very close to René Lévesque, that we're very close to René Lévesque. I never understood why they came to that idea of sovereignty that means that really independent. But when I mean independent, I mean a country with 100% of their capacity from a financial standpoint, from a law standpoint, and from a standpoint of relations. Now, once you're a country and you have those foreign relations, nothing is preventing you from making a deal or inventing a framework with another independent province that say, I think we should work on this together. We have a common interest. The difference in that model is that you respect the democracy and the legitimacy of both those parliaments. Whereas the current model is an illegitimate government that will tell you, based on not much, because oftentimes they're ultra-virus of their own constitution, they will tell you how it should be done, and your voice will not be heard, which is pretty much anti-democratic. So I think independence, it's important to have that word or that name, because it's with independence that you have foreign relations. And once you have foreign relations, you can set a deal, your own will, based on self-determination. Democratic self-determination is very different from the current model. And I don't see Canada stopping ever the abuse of powers that we've seen over and over so many decades. Human nature never leaves power on. They might make a deal with you and be nice with you right now if our independence project is getting serious. They might give you a few presents and give you a break for a while. But once your autonomous government will be out and will be replaced by a more federalist government, it will start again. That's the history of the Parti québécois. The irony with our party is that it's when the Parti québécois is in power that we make the most gains from the federal government. So people are just, it's working. But it's not, because as soon as you're out of power, the overall picture is that we've been in decline in terms of invasion of the federal in our fields of competence, but also decline of the French language, decline of many aspects that are.
So, along the lines of, should Alberta become an independent?
It will not. It will not, because the Fed has not done the Clarity Act and has not tried to get the judicial. They've not done all that because they worry about fairness. They worry about keeping their power, their regime. So I do not expect them to stop at this. They'll find something else to say at the end that they don't recognize it and that it doesn't work. They were not, so they lied during the referendum on the idea that they will recognize the result. They said that in the campaign, but we know for a fact, declarations afterwards, one of Jean Chrétien, that they were not.
J'ai un petit débat pour vous tout le monde. Moi, ça fait longtemps que j'y pense. Dites-moi ce que vous en pensez dans les commentaires. Est-ce que vous pensez que ce serait bien que dans la prochaine question sur l'indépendance du Québec, on mette en opposition, voulez-vous que le Québec devienne un pays indépendant? Puis, voulez-vous que le Québec signe la Constitution de 82?
Oh! Là, c'est risqué.
Ouais.
Moi, je ne mettrais pas ça. Je pensais que tu allais dire, voulez-vous que le Québec devienne un État indépendant ou que le Québec demeure une province canadienne? Ou...
Non. On les met en opposition.
Ouais, mais tu fais quoi si c'est la Constitution qui gagne de 82? On signe ça?
Dans la vie, il faut prendre des risques.
Ah, je sais pas. Quoique, techniquement, si la Constitution s'applique déjà, de toute façon.
Oui, c'est ça. Tu subis déjà.
Bon, c'est vrai qu'on l'a subi déjà.
Posture, tu sais, puis j'aime ça, cette posture-là, mais c'est comme une posture de non, on veut pas la signer parce que c'est une insulte, je suis d'accord. Mais pensez-y stratégiquement, là. Si le monde... Mais c'est parce que ça brouille un peu la question. Ça brouille la question parce que là, il va falloir que tu fasses la souveraineté puis la Constitution. Il va falloir t'expliquer au monde pourquoi la Constitution, c'est de la merde. Mais tout le monde qui ont passé tout leur temps à... Même les fédéralistes à pas vouloir la signer, c'est quoi, là? Ils vont accepter de la signer parce qu'ils veulent pas un pays?
Ils vont dire que c'est mieux ça que de devenir une province canadienne.
Moi, je me dis ça forcerait le monde à se positionner.
Mais en même temps, si on la... OK, mettons que on vote à 51% puis on l'a signé, puis là, on la signe. T'as pas l'impression que on va se dire, bon, ben le débat est réglé? Les Québécois ont fait un choix, ils ont voté pour rester dans le Canada puis signer la Constitution canadienne.
Ben, ça ne nous empêchera jamais de refaire un autre référendum.
Ouais, mais l'argument va être encore plus valide de... Les Québécois ont voté pour rester puis signer la Constitution canadienne. Ils veulent être dans le Canada.
Je suis d'accord, mais moi, je veux pas le perdre le prochain. Je suis
Non,
pas en
non
mode
plus.
je pourrais le perdre. Je suis en mode comment le gagner. Puis là, je me demande, est-ce que ça augmenterait nos chances de gagner?
Mais il faut quand même prendre en considération qu'il y a des risques, puis il faut faire attention, puis il faut être prudent. Faut pas trop risquer non plus.
Mais tu vois, c'est ça. Moi, je suis en mode... Ben,
honnêtement,
je suis pas sûr du tout. Là. Mais je suis pas favorable à ça nécessairement. C'est juste une question que je me pose, puis je me dis, est-ce qu'on n'est pas mieux de se dire, genre, faut y aller all-in? Puis quand tu y vas all-in, tu fais pas semblant. Il n'y a pas de demi-mesure, il n'y a pas de plan B, c'est faut gagner.
Est-ce qu'on... Puis là, je suis vraiment pas constitutionnaliste, puis je pense que ça serait intéressant, dites-nous-le dans les commentaires, si ça serait intéressant d'avoir un constitutionnaliste pour nous parler de ces questions-là, mais est-ce qu'on serait pas mieux de demander aux gens, voulez-vous que le Québec... 3 questions. Voulez-vous que le Québec adopte toutes ses lois? Question 1. Voulez-vous que le Québec gère tous ses impôts et ses taxes? Question 2. Et voulez-vous que le Québec signe tous ses traités internationaux? Question 3. Puis admettons qu'on vote oui aux lois puis aux impôts. Ben, ça serait déjà ça de gagner. Ben, est-ce que ça se fait dans le cadre... Est-ce que ça se fait dans le cadre canadien? Moi, c'est la question que je me pose.
Ben non.
On pourrait pas décider, ben regardez, on a voté pour cesser d'envoyer nos impôts à Ottawa.
Non.
Ça fonctionne pas de même?
Non, regarde, l'Alberta, ils ont voté en 2021 pour arrêter la péréquation. Ça n'a rien bougé, là. Ils ont voté genre à 60% le fédéral, il a regardé le vote puis il a dit bah ouais, bravo, passez à autre chose. Prochaine question.
Bon. Dans ce cas-là, je vous annonce qu'on va tenir un référendum le 25 juin. Voulez-vous une Saint-Jean à longueur d'année ou vous ne voulez plus jamais de Saint-Jean? Ça va être ça la question. On soumet ça le 24 juin.
Ben là on voulait une question simple, toi tu l'as compliqué. Moi c'était A ou B, tu sais.
Oh, toi tu l'as compliqué. Premièrement, je réfléchis à voix haute avec la communauté. Si t'es contre la réflexion, c'est ton droit. Moi, je suis favorable à la réflexion. Qu'est-ce que t'as à répondre à ça?
Non, tu sais que je suis un grand fan de la liberté d'expression.
Bon, voilà. Mais plus sérieusement, oui, je suis favorable à une question tout à fait simple. Voulez-vous que le Québec devienne un État souverain? Je pense que au moins ça. Puis après ça, ben, on peut trouver peut-être d'autres questions sous l'angle de on veut trouver de quoi de simple, mais qui va être aussi représentatif de la réalité.
Ah ouais, 100%. Mais je suis content qu'il l'ait dit là. Ben, il l'avait déjà dit d'ailleurs.
Oui, c'est pas nouveau.
C'est quand même un consensus dorénavant dans le mouvement, mais bon, c'est toujours le fun à entendre.
Mais c'est intéressant quand il dit justement, ils n'ont pas fait la loi, le fédéral n'a pas fait la loi sur la clarté par souci de garant démocrate, par souci de transparence, par souci de respecter la démocratie. Ça n'a rien à voir avec ça. La seule raison pour laquelle ils ont fait la loi sur la clarté, c'est pour nous maintenir, puis trouver des prétextes pour maintenir le Québec dans le cadre constitutionnel canadien, puis trouver des obstacles à l'émancipation du Québec. 100%. Trouver des raisons de dire non, nous ne reconnaissons pas votre résultat. Il se trouve des raisons de nier la démocratie. Puis ils vont toujours, même avec la question la plus claire au monde, trouver quelque chose pour dire nous ne reconnaissons pas votre résultat. Moi, je ne m'attends pas à ce que le lendemain d'un référendum, le gouvernement canadien dise parfait, vous avez fait un processus respectueux de la loi sur la clarté, vous avez gagné, bien joué, voilà votre indépendance. Ça fonctionne pas de même. Va falloir.
Mais on va espérer que le côté le plus anglais du Canada ressorte. Qu'est-ce que tu veux que je te dise? Les Anglais sont démocrates.
Oui.
Mais effectivement, on verra.
Les Anglais n'ont jamais bafoué la démocratie.
Non, mais ils ont quand même respecté le vote du Brexit alors que leurs élites étaient clairement défavorables.
Oui. Mais là, c'est pas le même contexte. Là. C'est
mais
pas un État qui veut se séparer du Canada. Là.
Non, j'ai dit le côté anglais. Tu sais.
Au
fond, là, dans leurs racines, peut-être qu'on verra.
J'ai pas l'impression.
Recognize it. And so abuse of power doesn't stop overnight. And I'm not naive about it. But to answer your question, yes, it's about independence, and the question will be very to the point.
Okay, well, since we opened the Clarity Act can of worms, I guess we'll go down it a little bit. I think the only two places in Canada as it's currently constituted, or where there's any kind of number of people who've actually really looked into it, is in Quebec and Alberta, because we're the ones who would have to deal with it.
Yep.
I generally thought the first 2 points of the Clarity Act are reasonable. A clear question, clear majority. Okay, I mean, that's pretty hard to disagree with. But it's after that where it just says...
But even the clear majority, it's just...
That could get hazy. I generally say...
It's written abuse of power all over it.
Yeah,
because, I mean, what's democracy if it's not to win or to lose?
Trudeau's been in power with 35% of the vote two times, and he gets almost all the power.
No.
So what's clear majority?
There are defensive mechanisms to keep power.
But where the big problematic area to me is, where I've seen is that, okay, say Alberta or Quebec had a clear question and a clear majority. Let's just say for the sake of argument, it was 80%, overwhelming. No one's going to get that, but let's just say that.
Yep.
But then all it does is oblige Ottawa to negotiate. And you would need unanimity of all the other provinces and Ottawa together. And at that point, I feel like it's by design to just bog us down in negotiations, and they can make unreasonable demands of Quebec or unreasonable demands of Alberta and say, well, we're just not agreeing to it. And that leads to two possible outcomes at that point, which is either we just give up on it and accept status quo despite what people have voted for, or the magic word, unilateral declaration of independence.
Of course.
Is that something you're prepared to do in the event where you enter into negotiations, which would be reasonable, but those negotiations are maybe not in good faith? Would a government, after a successful referendum on independence and negotiations breaking down, is a unilateral declaration of independence something you would be prepared to make?
The whole question here is legitimacy of a government that controls or nominates the judicial power, and that will not let it happen and will find any reason or excuse not to recognize the legitimacy of that change. And that change is currently being discussed in Alberta and Quebec and might be discussed elsewhere, depending on where this leads. I don't find myself obliged by a regime that I don't find legitimate. My only loyalty is towards my people who elected me. The rest for me is a foreign regime out of a colonial mentality and framework. And so when I refused to give an oath to the King of England, people told me, oh, the Constitution won't let you. And I don't care. I mean, what legitimacy for that Constitution if Quebec never agreed to it? It's clearly the spin-off of the colonial regime and the willingness to make Francophones a minority in that new ensemble. Why should I accept to lie and give my loyalty to a foreign king just because you tell me a constitution that is illegitimate tells me so? So I didn't decide to put a knee down and to make that oath. I just continued. And I said, this is not legitimate. So legitimacy in democracy is much more important than legal documents that actually were never consented upon by the different members of that ensemble. So that's where declaring the independence of Quebec, if I have a majority of my people supporting me, is not only what I'm going to do, it's my devoir, it's my obligation. Because I know that there's no future. The policies of Canada are working against Quebec's interests in so many ways. There's no future for French-speaking with a Quebec culture. That kind of Quebec will not exist in 100 years if I don't do anything. And financially speaking, I don't want charity from any other province. And I don't feel it's normal to send almost half of my tax income.
Juste, j'ai vu une question, Vix, qui disait « C'est confirmé le référendum en 2026 ». La réalité, c'est que, oui, il y a un référendum sur plusieurs questions là, en Alberta, mais puis moi je trouve que c'est une bonne idée, mais ce qu'ils ont fait surtout, c'est qu'ils ont changé la loi sur les moyens pour tenir un référendum en Alberta, puis il y a des référendums d'initiative citoyenne en Alberta. Puis ce qu'elle a fait, Daniel Smith, c'est qu'elle a réduit drastiquement le nombre de gens qu'il fallait qu'ils signent, à tel point qu'aujourd'hui, il y a beaucoup, beaucoup plus de gens qui sont pour l'indépendance de l'Alberta que de signatures nécessaires. Fait que c'est presque... elle a mis les mécanismes en place pour que ce soit presque certain qu'il va y avoir un référendum, même sur l'indépendance de l'Alberta. Là. Genre, c'est quasiment mécanique.
To a government that duplicates or wastes the money I've gained. I disagree with that. So legitimacy, I think, is really important in understanding what's coming, whether it comes from Alberta or it comes from Quebec, because otherwise you see it from other governments in the world. Like there's no end to being in bad faith using legal instruments that you've created yourself to protect yourself and protect your power. I mean, democracy is...
Excuse-moi, Vieux-Loup. Ce que j'ai dit, c'est que je suis pas mal certain qu'on va faire une soirée sur le référendum. C'est de la politique, ça nous intéresse. Comme s'il y en avait un en Écosse demain. Je pense que je prends l'avion puis je vais là-bas. Non, j'exagère. Mais c'est sûr qu'on manquera pas ça.
Much more about popular legitimacy than a power that tries to hold on to what they have.
I'm going to get into the finance side of what independence, etc. in a bit, but that's interesting. You've said that Alberta's independence, or more broadly speaking, nationalist movement, because we have a spectrum as well. We've got hardline autonomists who want to still fly the maple leaf, but want as little control from Ottawa as possible, to people who are full independents. We have a spectrum like yourselves.
Yeah.
But you've said that Alberta's independence or nationalist movement benefits Quebec's independence movement. But a lot of our independence movement is on different sets of issues as yours.
Which is perfectly normal.
Yeah. I mean, Quebec's is, I grew up with a pretty unfavorable view of Quebec, and that's really changed over the years. As I've come to understand Alberta's struggle, and also as I've come to Quebec, when I visit Quebec City, I get such a different feeling there than in almost any Anglo city. It's a place where you can feel the history in the air, in the architecture. There is a old people with a culture worth preserving there. You can feel it, and I'm somewhat envious of it. I think Calgary is one.
On fait un clip juste de ça, puis c'est comme déclaration d'amour d'un Albertain.
C'est rare qu'on entend ça, ça fait du bien.
Ouais, c'est bien.
Vraiment. Hein?
Il y a des beaux
c'est limpide. C'est limpide. Il est venu au Québec, puis il l'a vu.
Ouais.
Il l'a constaté de ses propres yeux en se promenant dans la ville de Québec. Il n'a même pas écouté la culture québécoise tant que ça. Là. Il n'a pas appris le français, puis il s'est mis à écouter les cowboys fringants, les colocs, puis il s'est juste promené dans la ville de Québec, puis il a fait « Oh, OK, je suis vraiment ailleurs. Je suis pas en Alberta, là. Je suis pas au Canada. Là. C'est autre chose. »
Ouais, 100%, c'est comme les Québécois qui me disent « Je suis Canadien. » Je suis comme « T'es-tu déjà allé dans le Canada? » Non. Ouais. On s'en parle quand t'as été. Moi, je l'ai fait en autobus pendant 3 semaines. J'ai une bonne idée de c'est quoi être Canadien maintenant. C'est bien correct, mais c'est pas moi.
One of the very few other... Quebec City and Calgary have a real unique sense of culture. I think Calgary's losing it very quickly. But I've come to understand Quebec's need to preserve what it has. Sometimes that irks us in terms of how it flows out of its borders, and from our perspective, some dull standards. But I've come to very much understand the struggle you're having and why you do it. But our nationalist or independence movement is less cultural, more focused on economics and fiscal issues.
Ça, là, on clip ça, puis on envoie ça à nos amis de Yann et Frank. Parce que ça, c'est un média qui je suis allé lire, là, je ne connaissais pas. Il est assez à droite économiquement, très, 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 très conservateur. Je pense qu'il appuie Maxime Bernier. Donc, ils sont quand même bien à droite. Puis, ce qu'ils viennent de dire, là, je comprends votre lutte pour protéger le français, pour protéger votre culture. Même si de notre point de vue, des fois, ça nous fait chier puis ça nous irrite, là. Mais c'est nécessaire, puis il faut que vous le fassiez, parce que c'est beau puis il faut le protéger. Je pense que ça vaudrait la peine que nos amis Diane et Frank entendent qu'ils puissent entendre un gars de droite économique le dire. Ouais, c'est ça, c'est full de droite. Western.
Ouais, ça paraît, là, même l'esthétique. Puis...
Ben, je me disais, ça paraît que c'est très albertain, là, mais en même temps, y a-tu vraiment des médias de gauche
il doit, je sais pas.
En Alberta? Ils doivent pas être
fort. En tout cas, c'est un média qui a pris fait tes causes pour l'indépendance du Québec. C'est encourageant. On va se bâtir un local comme ça. Hein? Qu'est-ce que t'en penses?
Ouais, ben oui, ça serait mon rêve.
Là, dans le chat, on est 47. Là, tout le monde, envoyez-nous 1000$.
T'es un peu ambitieux, là.
Ouais. Mais oui, c'est notre rêve. On a déjà vu des locaux où moi et Marc-Antoine, on s'est dit, c'est là que ça va se passer.
Ah oui, si on pouvait agrandir puis avoir...
Donnez-nous le temps. Là. 2 ans encore, puis vous allez voir, on va être prêt tranquille.
On a déjà une campagne de financement. Je vois quelqu'un qui dit « Part un Zéphi ». On a une campagne de financement en cause. Donc, si vous voulez donner, vous allez la retrouver. Allez sur nos réseaux sociaux. On fait souvent des publications là-dessus. Mais oui, ça serait extraordinaire. Ne serait-ce que d'avoir 1, 2, 3 personnes à temps plein pour faire du contenu indépendantiste, mener des entrevues, publier des articles, faire des publications sur les réseaux sociaux, préparer des événements.
Ben non, mais une personne à temps plein, wow.
Ouais.
Wow. Déjà, on a Marc-Antoine à temps plein. Puis,
ouais, c'est ça.
Puis il travaille à temps plein. Fait que imaginez, Marc-Antoine a double temps plein.
Ouais. Ah ouais. Mais toi aussi, en fait, on est plusieurs à faire ça. Toi aussi, tu le fais à temps plein.
On met du temps.
Ah ouais, on met beaucoup de temps.
Ouais,
mais à double temps plein, là.
Ouais, si en plus, ça pouvait être ma job, plus mon temps plein, tabarouette. Hein?
Ouais. Parce qu'il y a des limites.
Sur la péréquation, je vous en sors une par chaque semaine, là, puis fancy, puis tout. Là.
Il y a des limites à ce qu'on peut faire en ce moment, là.
Ouais. Okay. On va y arriver.
Ouais, ça s'en vient.
Puis le monde, ils sont derrière nous, fait que ça va bien.
So when we fight about equalization, and a large part of the bone we pick is with Quebec, how does, even because we're picking a bone is largely in terms of, we don't, we'll get into the numbers a bit. We don't want to be seen as subsidizing Quebec. We're angry at Quebec for opposing pipeline construction to get our products to market. How does us picking fights on fronts that are largely with Quebec benefit Quebec's nationalist movement?
Well, I think one of the reasons why I'm in Calgary today is that I was kind of tired of a non-conversation that pertains to whether Alberta would make the same choices of Quebec than Quebec and vice versa, and financial disputes that are all the consequences of a system that you didn't agree upon and I didn't agree upon. So from my standpoint, I don't want Alberta's money. I think that if Quebec stopped sending 90 billions a year to Ottawa for little services and a lot of dysfunctionality, a government that always contradicts our own government and always too often for me, a lot of waste, a lot of mismanagement. If we get rid of that, I mean, I don't want equalization payments. It's not good for our economy because getting money is the worst strategy in terms of entrepreneurship and growth and
I don't mean to interrupt,
economic value.
But you have said, I don't know the exact words because I can't read or speak French,
yep.
But so correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you've said that Quebec isn't reliant on equalization from Alberta, but Alberta's contributed $67 billion to equalization since 1957. Quebec is, at least in gross terms, not per capita, but gross terms, the largest recipient.
Yeah.
So I want to try to make sense with what you've said. You said we don't want equalization.
No. And
what you're saying, Quebec is not reliant on equalization. I think I see those two as incongruent.
Yeah. I have a wonderful document. I might find it right now.
Hmm?
So this is the finances of an independent Quebec. You have 6 economists from different universities in Quebec who oversaw the works. And basically what that says is that if you limit your analysis to equalization...
I knew I was going to ask this.
If you limit your analysis to equalization payments, then you'll say this is a scandal and everything. But the way the federal government works is that it takes a lot of money out of our pockets, and then it spends. It spends much more than what equalization payment is overall.
Yeah, but we have to talk about total net in the net.
So you have to look at investment, direct investment in the economy, You have to look at how the government, the federal government invests or does not invest in assets, in infrastructure, because it's very unequal, depending. And you have to look at how much there's obvious duplication and obvious waste, because if you're in a scenario where Alberta is independent and Quebec is independent, you will not be spending for 2 ministers of health, and you'll not be spending for doing 2 times the same thing and arguing about it because you disagree. You won't have that anymore.
I agree with that.
So with very, very conservative and prudent standards, we come to the conclusion that then even though we wouldn't get equalization payments, other factors such as direct investment in the economy, other factors such as stopping this duplication and this waste, and other factors such as having our own monetary strategy, our own international commerce strategy, would make us more rich. Because the truth about equalization payments is that it hinders our economy, our entrepreneurship. The Canadian dollar is also very much related to oil and gas, which has an impact on our exports. So overall, to say that Quebec, at the level of wealth and productivity we have, couldn't stand alone as a country is just undefendable. Obviously, we will find a way, but it will be our strategy, our way, and we will not need foreign money. And I don't want to, but we will not take the contempt that goes with it too, because the public discourse on those,
there is contempt.
That's just pure contempt. So is it good for us? No. So I'll be glad that all this stopped, and you'll be glad. So, and then afterwards,
now we're talking Turkey.
Yeah, and then afterwards, we can sit down and say, okay. So now we decide for ourselves. We're responsible for ourselves. But are there fields or things that we really want to work together on a common framework, because it just makes sense?
Yeah.
And then you'll get something that is effective and useful. But the current federal government is just raising taxes, and they were not doing this before the First World War. They didn't need, but it's a source of power. You just raise taxes, and then you use that money as power, saying, hey, you want something for your university? Here's my requirement.
You have to do this.
You need DEI everywhere. You want something for your...
really learn to talk to Albertans.
No, but it's a huge debate in Quebec, because it's about freedom of research, and sometimes I would even say false knowledge that is forced by the federal government, who has all sorts of requirements for money that is ours. They take it in our pocket, and instead of sending it back, so for healthcare, we ask for $6 billion based on historical contributions of the federal in the healthcare systems. But they're so busy starting new programs and inventing things, they don't have any more money for fundamentals such as healthcare. So are we better off just keeping all the money in Quebec and just managing it? And if we make mistakes with it, our responsibility. Are we better off in that system? Obviously, yes. So
is that available in English? I'd like to...
No, it was published in the official language. But figures are figures.
But if you guys were able to send me a digital version, I could run it through Google Translate.
I think we can do something.
I'd be interested to see,
because calculations are calculations.
Yeah, I'd be. I've been in politics and I was the finance critic. You can make a calculation, say anything.
One thing I want to say to those listening to us who are interested in the possibility of the independence of Alberta, bear in mind that when you're going to make calculations, and obviously you're going to come to the conclusion that if you stop sending money to Ottawa and you keep it here, and you make choices more aligned with your commercial strategy or industrial strategy, you'll be richer. That will be the conclusion. What the agents of the regime, because I call them like that, so you'll have agents of the federal regime everywhere in society that will say, it's never going to work and you should fear your freedom. You should fear your self-determination. It's going to be a disaster. What they'll say is, oh, all the variables are not certain. So you say that this and that variable is like that, but you have no certainty. But the trap...
J'aime comment il est en train, littéralement... Mais c'est vraiment intéressant parce que dans le fond, on voit à quel point il est conscient de tous les défis et les enjeux qu'on a connus, nous. Tu sais, il est en train de leur expliquer, ils vont vous faire ça, ils vont vous dire ça. Il est comme en train de tout décortiquer la mécanique, puis sais, tu vois qu'il l'a tout intégré, puis il sait comment ça se passe. Puis comme là, attendez-vous à ça, ça va être de même, ça va être de même, ça va être de même, parce qu'ils vont réagir de la même façon qu'ils ont réagi avec nous.
Ben, je pense que ça met aussi la table pour nous, dans la mesure où il explique en quoi c'est pas bon quand le fédéral fait ça. C'est juste profondément injuste. Puis que, comme démocrate, on devrait pas accepter ça, qu'on soit québécois ou albertain. Quand ils vont nous faire ça, ou quand ils vont vous faire ça, le gouvernement fédéral, ben, ne l'acceptez pas.
Ouais, laissez-vous pas faire.
Laissez-vous pas faire, puis laissez-nous pas tomber.
Ouais.
Soyez avec nous, puis ne l'acceptez pas.
Here is, what certainty had Justin Trudeau in power in terms of economics for the past 10 years? What certainty Mark Carney has? I mean, we had zero growth during 10 years based on really an ideological drift from immigration and commerce and economic strategies. I mean, just so people understand, sound calculations will be met by the regime with arguments on uncertainty of variables. The truth is, variables are always uncertain. What counts is the fundamentals. Is the reasoning sound? Are the fundamentals solid? And then, of course, things happen and things change in terms of context. But if your fundamentals make sense, obviously, there are so many countries in the world. Obviously, countries get along and they make their own choice.
Right. So I'm getting a better understanding of what you're saying. That yes, Quebec is maybe a net recipient of federal dollars, but Ottawa is just so inefficient and duplicative that independence, even without a net influx of federal dollars, you'd still be ahead.
Slightly ahead. That's what the figures say.
Slightly ahead.
Slightly better off,
but then you would have total autonomy to do it as you see fit.
Our own strategy.
Yeah, and you would have, I guess, kind of come back to what I was saying earlier. More autonomy or total independence to protect your culture, your way of life, language, etc. When I'm having discussions about Alberta independence versus Quebec independence with people, I use, it's an imperfect analogy, but they're very different kinds of nationalism. As I've said, one, Alberta's tends to be more civic nationalism, although defending our culture is becoming an issue as mass migration becomes a huge issue. That's actually becoming an issue here now, where it wasn't really previously. But I've said that Quebec nationalists, or people who might be in the middle on that, their heart tells them independence, but their brain tells them Canada because of equalization, things like that. You've made your point on it.
Yeah, but I think it's the opposite.
But I've said
their brain will get to the conclusion that we should be a country, and then fear will come into play. So I would place it rather that way.
Yeah, I'm speaking very generally and imperfectly, but I've said that Quebecers, because it's more of a cultural nationalism, their hearts
they're attached. Oh, God.
Yeah. Their hearts are in it, but their brains, and this might be the fear part, the brains say, it's uncertain, we're going to lose equalization, etc. So the brains say no. And then in Alberta, it's the opposite. We broadly understand that we are massively subsidizing the rest of Canada, that our brains say we would be significantly better off as an independent country, but our hearts, well, we're English-speaking Canadians. Our hearts are in Canada, but our brains are independent. So that these are opposite.
They are, because in Quebec, the federal government is not there. It's very strange. Our government is in Quebec City. It's the National Assembly. And the space for what happens in the House of Commons in Ottawa and the news cycle it's totally absent. It's not there because we don't feel it's our government. And sometimes you hear Quebecers talking about money that the federal government sends, or it's as if it's foreign money. We've been paying taxes.
Albertans are increasingly feeling like it's foreign too.
We just agreed that this was not healthy. What I want to say is that you are maybe entering a new phase where you are now in Quebec's position, where you would like something else than the Liberals in power, and then you realize it's not going to happen, even in extreme circumstances. That's Quebec situation with the Bloc Québécois for decades. If we express what we want at the federal level, oftentimes, the vast majority of times, the answer will be Bloc Québécois. That Bloc Québécois cannot rule, cannot be in power. Mm-hmm. It can basically act as a defensive mechanism.
Many of us are envious of the Bloc.
Against abuses of powers. And there are so many, so they do their best. But it's not sustainable. It's not something you want forever.
So the Bloc Québécois was meant to be a very short-term mechanism.
So I'm not from Alberta, so I don't want to, but I imagine that after Trudeau's government, if you end up that there's no alternative, there's no rotation, it might trigger questions that we have for a long time, thinking if we cannot have, if we don't have any probabilities or reasonable rotation of what we think cures what we dislike with, for instance, the Trudeau government, people will start asking themselves, okay, so what are the other options? Because we're pretty not heard. We're pretty much out of the system. And it's the case as well with judiciary power. So the more the judiciary power takes power over democratic choices of parliaments, if those judges are almost all aligned with the Liberal Party of Canada in terms of way of thinking and ideology, those questions exist in Quebec for decades. They might become more present and relevant in Alberta, given what I've just mentioned as a political development in Ottawa.
We're limited on time, so I'm trying to figure out which one I want to get at. Your staff is going to get angry if I go too far over. So maybe you could be a real short one on this. Certain areas, part of my family comes from Bavaria in Germany.
Yeah.
And Bavaria has a different title that it calls itself. It's not just a Länder, a state in Germany. It calls itself a free state, Freistaat.
Yeah.
I know you want independence, but as an interim step, I've talked about Alberta should stop. One thing I've really admired is Quebec, especially Quebec nationalist politicians. They never call Quebec a province. That's something I've picked up in the link.
But you know what province means? Conquered land.
Yeah. Oh, it comes Provence, which was conquered by the Roman. Roman
it's from Provincia.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's a conquered land. So of course we don't consent to a conquered land.
I'm kind of letting slip in our style guide here. I've picked this up. I've taken a lot of the Quebec language, and I don't refer to Alberta and Saskatchewan as provinces as much as I can in our own pages here. But sometimes the language gets different because they are provinces. So I've thought that Alberta and Saskatchewan should unilaterally, even without changing the constitution, at least call themselves a free state. It's the same powers of a province. It is changing what Quebec calls itself. The symbolism matters, and the Quebec nationalist movement is decades ahead of Alberta. Would you, as an interim step, do something like call Quebec a free state or something like that? Just it's a title change.
The problem we have right now is that at the pace things are going, the way the federal policies are oriented and the impact it has in Quebec,
ça, c'est pas assez dit.
The specificity of Quebec from a linguistic and cultural.
J'ai vu un commentaire de Granit, il dit « nous copie LOL ». Moi, je m'intéresse beaucoup au mouvement souverainiste dans le monde entier, puis le monde entier nous copie. Genre, juste le mot souverainiste, c'est le mot que les Français l'ont pris au Québec. Les Français qui sont pour le Frexit, là, que la France quitte l'Union européenne, ils ont pris ce mot-là du Québec. Ils ont été directement cherchés dans notre vocabulaire. Dans le monde entier, là, les Catalans ont regardé ce qu'on a fait. Les Écossais ont regardé ce qu'on a fait. Autant pour savoir quoi faire, pas faire, tu sais, c'est dans les deux sens, mais on a été une source d'inspiration exceptionnelle pour le monde entier, puis c'est pas assez vu et connu et redit parce que peut-être qu'on n'a pas un regard très fort sur le monde, les relations internationales tout le temps, mais on inspire beaucoup de monde. Ouais, les Corses aussi, c'est vrai. D'ailleurs, il y a des délégations qui viennent au Québec pour apprendre, pour savoir qu'est-ce qu'on fait, comment on a fait. Fait que dites-vous honnêtement, on réalise pas à quel point si le Québec devenait un pays, on serait un phare pour beaucoup de peuples. on montrerait à beaucoup de peuples que c'est possible, après autant de combats, de le faire pacifiquement. On ouvrirait vraiment un chemin pour beaucoup de peuples qui pourraient trouver leur émancipation aussi, puis partager ça avec nous.
C'est aussi vrai pour le camp du non. Hein. Jean Chrétien a malheureusement conseillé le camp du non en Écosse en 2014. Ça se fait des deux bords, malheureusement. Il faut dire que le Québec est un laboratoire de référendum et de processus démocratique.
J'aurais aimé pas savoir que Jean Chrétien était capable. En tout cas, ouais. Oui. Bon, vous voyez, dans le bon comme dans le mal. Hein? Mais on inspire les gens. Puis ici, on arrive à faire notre pays. Imaginez la vague le souffle vital qu'on va pouvoir donner à tous ces peuples-là qui sont peut-être pas dans la meilleure phase.
Fait que quand on parlait tantôt du caractère démocrate des Anglais, là, sont allés chercher Jean Chrétien pour les conseiller.
Ouais.
Fait que je pense que le côté démocrate est un peu loin.
Hein?
Ouais, c'est ça. Jean Chrétien qui n'est pas un grand démocrate.
Ouais.
Point of view will not last for very long. A bit like what happened to francophones in every other province.
We're losing it in English Canada even.
Okay, so then you understand that in the history of the Parti québécois, and you have that with the CQ, that is the current government in Quebec, you'll have a tendency to say, what can we do
l'impression qu'on serait même
that
plus que les
is symbolic, but we know it's not going to change much, but at least we have our own party at that point, you know? We'll say, oh, we did that. So we'll change unilaterally a part of the Canadian Constitution to say we're a nation.
Mm-hmm.
And then we'll say it's a historic moment and it's great, it's awesome. So let's say we start calling ourselves free states. Mm-hmm. If we're not free and we haven't achieved any change in a system that abuses powers over what should be ruled and decided by our respective parliaments, what good do we get? I mean, so I don't oppose it, of course. I will never be against initiatives that show that we're not a province in the sense of the Latin word. But I'm somewhere else at this point because I don't think there's any future for French-speaking Quebec if we don't get out of Canada as soon as possible. So given that analysis or diagnosis I've made, don't expect the government of the Parti québécois to do some things only because it looks good or feels good. And I'm afraid that sometimes in symbolics, we're not going forward. You can be declining very, very fast while making symbolics that feel good. And I think that's a good resume of what the CEQ has done. It's a huge decline under the CEQ in all respects, housing, French language, culture. But they've done things. Like they have done things that probably were in good faith, but the impact of those things are not proportional to the level of challenge under Trudeau's government, under the Liberals. And I don't see things changing under Carney. It's the same people, the same mentality of them deciding instead of us on fundamental things for our cultural and linguistic sustainability.
So I'm just going to fit one last question in before your staff member goes and pulls the plug on their microphones here.
Sure. Well, she's not very aggressive.
She's friendly. She's not. She seems nice. As I've said, Alberta and Quebec both want decentralization and more power at home, but we tend to want different kinds. Quebec more cultural, Alberta more physical, but we do to some extent. We both
and things are changing. I mean,
I increasingly want more here. Immigration is not just a physical issue now; it is very much a social issue, and so we've talked about where. So building those alliances, I find, has the two big decentralist provinces, to use that dirty word. But we've wanted different kinds, and in large measure, that is why Meech-like and especially Charlottetown Accords failed. Quebec and Alberta were the two leading areas of Canada that voted down Charlottetown, but we voted it down for very different reasons. Albertans and Westerners broadly voted it down because it was seen as creating asymmetrical federalism, giving special deals to Quebec, and there was also some First Nations issues in it. There was, it was a huge agreement. but we voted it down for one set of reasons, being seen as overly appeasing Quebec. Quebecers voted it down, at least as I perceive it, as it didn't go far enough in defending Quebec's culture and autonomy. Mm-hmm. I know you prefer independence. I prefer independence. But, I mean, you've tried twice, didn't work. We haven't even had a shot at it, and even then it's a long shot for us to achieve it. Yeah. Failing independence, is there some kind of grand bargain?
On le sait.
We call it Charlottetown 2.
Le beau risque, ça s'appelle.
For us.
Yeah, but like, if failing independence, if independence is not successful, is there a kind of grand bargain from your perspective that you think you could make that would make the Quebec nation happy and content within Canada, that would work for you?
To the question, what does Quebec want? The answer is clear, crystal clear. Quebec wants self-determination, democratic self-determination. Why? Because it's the only model that gives a future to our specificity, linguistic and cultural. Other financial reasons have joined the reasons, but basically that's it. So, I mean, the only reason why federal prime ministers engaged into such complicated negotiations and talks was that they felt there was a direct threat to their power and their regime. They didn't do that in good faith because they just like to improve the life of Quebecers or Albertans. So it might happen that as Quebec's sovereignty movement, independence movement grows in strength, and probably Alberta's same movement grows in strength, you'll find federal politicians nervous saying, okay, let's renegotiate in good faith. I think we've been through that, and anything under self-determination in terms of our laws, our finances, and international relations will not work for Quebec because it will not work for our linguistic, cultural, and financial specificity. However, once it's done, so once Quebec declares independence, I think if Alberta declares independence, Quebec will follow, saying same here. Mm-hmm. Vice versa. If Quebec goes, I think Alberta will say, okay, I'm also independent. In which case, we will talk to each other about what framework would be useful on a number of topics, but without the federal trying to grab money and grab power and defend their privileges. Without them. Without interference and constant abuse of power since 1867, a constitution that we never voted or agreed upon. It's in direct link. It's really about the colonial regime for Quebec. So I think it's the other way around. You become independent, and a bit like Norway and Sweden or Slovakia and Czech Republic or in many, of course, in the following days, I will not be wanting to negotiate with the federal. I will want to negotiate with other provinces who think actually mostly the same thing as I do about how it should work. Doesn't mean we agree on our priorities, but we agree that a framework that would respect our respective, would show respect to our respective parliaments is much better than abuse of power based on a old and dysfunctional constitution. That and you have to add to that we were during the patriation of the 1982 Constitution, we were totally out of it. It's just the end of the contempt is a better start for a new framework than trying to deal with people who have been abusing their powers, begging them to stop abusing their powers, and take the immigration situation. So Justin Trudeau out of the blue, but not out of the blue. You had a group called the Century Initiative on Bay Street. They decided that we need to be 100 million Canadians based on whatever fluke economics. They don't consult anyone. They just start doing this by saying, hey, come to Roxham. Yep. And they changed the criteria at the airport. They really sabotaged our immigration system that was working well. They were warned by provinces, they were warned by their own public servants, you will create the worst housing crisis we've seen in decades, don't do it. And they did it anyway. So why would I negotiate with these people? Why would I give them legitimacy? They're abusing their power and they're toxic for the public good in Quebec. And I think many Albertans are starting to think the same in regards of their conception of public good in Alberta. So I'd rather have independence and then we make a deal and we talk, because I expect collaboration to be ongoing on so many things. Simply, we're used to it, and there are so many things we can work, and that's why I'm here. So just to say, by the way, the door is open. We have many things to talk about. But going through a new Charlottetown or a new Meech Lake, I just don't see where it could lead that is positive. I just don't see it.
Okay, well, I'm just going to sneak one last one because it's really quick. You've convinced me on a lot of things. So when you have that third referendum on independence, are you going to let Albertans vote in it?
Oh, I don't care. Well, you know that the federal government cheated on the second referendum by bringing in people that were not from Quebec in order them to vote in a result that was so close.
Yeah.
So among the things that maybe people listening to us in Alberta don't know. I mean, they arrested members of the Parti québécois. They stolen the list of members. They cheated during the patriation of the Constitution. They cheated during the referendums. I mean, at some point, yes, there could be some kind of solidarity or some common understanding of the fact that serving genuine democracy is serving public good. And that's why when you're asking me about how the federal will react in terms of Clarity Act and so on, there's been so many instances where the federal cheated and was dishonest. So I don't expect anything else. And yes, some form of collaboration on the fundamentals would be useful. And I think that's why I'm here. Your self-determination in Alberta is yours to determine. It's yours to decide. And if you feel you have a common identity and common interests that are worth becoming a country, good for you. And it's not for me to have a judgment on it, but if I can be useful to democracy, or if we can be useful to both our interests, economic interests in the short term and so on, why not talk instead of being in that weird equalization and federal framework where nobody agrees because the interests are just not compatible and the abuse of power is so constant it creates frustration. So I think in a way the reason I'm here is exactly that. So we can talk at least and see what positive could come in the next decades, given the decade we just experimented under the liberals, federal liberals.
Well, I think this has been a fascinating conversation. I think this is the kind of conversation, the whole dynamic of it is not something that Quebecers, Albertans, Westerners, or Canadians broadly are very used to. So I really appreciate you coming in.
And I salute them, all of those who listened, and I might be back, so there'll be other opportunities to think about this situation.
Our invitation is open. We'd love to have you back. Thank you very much. Thank you. All right, that's...
Il a dit, si vous le faites, nous autres, on s'en va. Fait que... Effectivement, ça n'a pas été beaucoup partagé puis vu, mais...
C'était combien? J'ai pas vu.
3600.
Ben, quand même.
Ouais, c'est bien, mais je me dis, imagine là, si on avait diffusion de ça au Québec, là, qui nous faisait tourner ça. Alors...
3000, c'est pas si mal. Il y a moins de monde en Alberta aussi, non?
Non, c'est bon. Puis clairement, ils sont organisés puis ils sont professionnels. Fait que ils ont plus de moyens que nous, en tout cas en termes de médias puis de diffusion que ce qu'on a. Là. Pour un mouvement souverainiste naissant, c'est assez impressionnant.
Ouais. Ben, ils ont des moyens, hein?
Ils ont de l'argent. Ça, c'est vrai qu'ils ont de l'argent. C'est l'avantage. C'est l'avantage.
Moi, je trouve ça assez positif, somme toute cette tournée-là. Je pense qu'il a fait d'autres médias, est-ce que je ne m'abuse, sans les écouter, là, mais je pense qu'il a fait d'autres médias.
Moi, j'ai vu sa conférence J'ai pas vu les autres médias. Peut-être qu'il a fait d'autres choses, mais comme, en tout cas, du contenu là, ça, c'était le seul.
Ouais. Mais sans l'ombre d'un doute, ils en ont parlé dans d'autres médias.
Ouais, ils en ont parlé dans le Calgary Sun. Ils en ont parlé dans les médias. Là. Oui, ils en ont parlé. J'ai pas d'article, mais attends, j'en ai vu. Fait que... Non,
mais d'emblée, c'est ça. Je trouve ça intéressant qu'il fasse ce genre de tournée-là, que ça soit en Alberta. Il l'avait déjà fait en Écosse, il l'a déjà fait en France également. De ce que j'ai compris dans une entrevue qu'il a donnée à Cube Radio à Benoît Dutrisac, qui va le faire aussi dans d'autres provinces canadiennes. Puis ce qui est bon, c'est qu'encore une fois, il ne change pas son message. Il reste sur ses fondamentaux, il martèle son message. Puis ça, en politique, ça vaut de l'or. Fait que ça, je salue ça. Ça démontre une certaine forme d'intégrité qui est vraiment importante. Puis ça plaît, puis il est ouvert au dialogue aussi. Il était quand même en terrain habituellement hostile, mais le simple fait d'y aller, je pense que ça permet de baisser les armes. Puis je pense que les gens étaient contents de pouvoir échanger avec lui. Surtout qu'il est dans une position favorable dans les sondages. Ça fait plus d'1 an qu'il est donné en terrain majoritaire s'il y avait une élection générale au Québec. Donc les gens en Alberta, ils ont quand même la possibilité de parler directement au prochain potentiel premier ministre du Québec si la tendance se maintient. C'est quand même pas rien comme occasion. Puis je pense qu'ils le prennent avec beaucoup d'intérêt puis beaucoup de sérieux. On le sentait tant dans la conférence que dans ce média-là. Ils sont très intéressés à la question. Moi, j'ai trouvé que... J'ai pas écouté la conférence au complet. Je pensais qu'on l'écouterait au complet. Je vais le faire de mon bord. Elle semblait bien connaître la question québécoise. Puis du côté du Western Standard.
Western Standard.
Ouais. Il connaissait assez bien quand même la question québécoise. Il a fait référence au cas de l'Écosse, il a fait référence à la Catalogne. Ça m'a surpris qu'un Albertain connaisse le mouvement indépendantiste en Catalogne. Là. Fait que...
Ben, clairement, eux, ils veulent faire l'indépendance, fait qu'ils s'intéressent à ce qui se fait. Hein. C'est ça, c'est la meilleure... en tout cas, c'est clairement une bonne façon de faire. Il le répète plusieurs fois aussi. On a intégré votre vocabulaire, on a intégré... tu sais.
Est-ce que lui était... Est-ce que tu sais s'il est indépendantiste?
Ouais, leur organisation est indépendantiste.
OK.
C'est ça que j'ai compris, c'est que le média au complet milite pour...
Pour l'indépendance complète, là, pas juste...
Non.
L'indépendance.
Lui, il l'a dit texto, là, il a dit... Ouais, The Independent Voice of... Ah non, attends. Of the New West. Fait que... ouais, c'est... Attends, on peut peut-être aller voir. Non, j'ai Editorial Principles. Ouais. Fighting for a strong and free Western Canada. C'est dans leur ligne éditoriale. Ça conclut. On n'a effectivement pas regardé la conférence au complet, mais c'est parce que c'était une autre heure.